Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back. Hope that you had a wonderful break and that you got some rest, that you relaxed, saw family. It's nice around here. Spring is upon us, and yeah, it's just really nice. Very happy to see you. It's been a long day for me. Full disclosure, a lot has happened, and got some difficult news this afternoon. Someone close to us got diagnosed with COVID, and we're a little concerned about, well, our potential exposure, to say the least. So I just discovered this like a few minutes ago, and I'm going to try to hold it together, but just keep in mind that, you know, um, I'm processing this, and it's just something that I've got to wrap my head around. We're discussing theories of protest and contentious politics. And this is the start of a new unit for us on non-electoral political behavior. And the thing is, especially in political science, we get so wrapped up focusing on voting and on formal parts of political behavior that we sometimes forget that there's actually a lot of political behavior that takes place outside of these conventional boundaries. And apart from voting, there's striking and protesting and rioting. There's um, engaging in attempted coups to prevent the counting of ballots. There's all sorts of political behavior that doesn't fit under the rubric of electoral behavior, or even more narrowly, voting. And this non-electoral political behavior is sometimes more consequential than the electoral political behavior, precisely because the non-electoral behavior can often operate outside of the boundaries of conventional routines and processes, and as a result can sometimes achieve really radical change that couldn't be achieved inside the system, so to speak. And this image that you're looking at here, striking, that's just one form of non-electoral political behavior. And that rubric of non-electoral behavior is quite broad, and there's a lot there. And in addition to riots and protests and strikes, there are demonstrations by social movements and many other types of actions that would fit with this theme of non-electoral behavior. And what we'll focus on today and this week in particular is social movements and the kinds of behavior associated with social movements. We'll talk about a variety of different questions that pertain to social movements, but the main focus for us as we embark is, again, non electoral participation. So, social movements will just form one part of this discussion, and we will see that there's quite a bit to it. I want us to think about the following questions as we study this third outcome of non electoral participation. First, what shapes individuals' propensity to strike, protest, or riot? Why is it that people do or do not engage in these forms of non electoral participation? What shapes the strength of the movements they form to reach those common goals? So those social movements that they generate in the process of seeking to reach their common or their collectively held goals, what is the key component of the strength of those movements or their capacity to exert influence in the non-electoral arena? And then second, what causes transformations in what non-electoral participation means to individuals or in their participation in social movements? So why is it that individuals think about social movements or non-electoral participation differently over time? Why do they participate more or less in these movements? Third, what causes a rise or fall in popular support for social movements? Why is it that social movements are sometimes received more favorably than others? Why is it that their sort of public image might rise or fall? And how does their success or their failure in turn depend on popular support or the strength of the movement? And more generally, what determines the success or the failure of these social movements? And so our general focus is non-electoral participation. And what that means then is we're focusing on those behaviors and those activities that don't fall under the rubric of voting or attending a meeting. Or I guess that would frankly be non-electoral participation, but for our purposes, we'll focus on those more interesting parts like strikes or protests or riots. So a starting point, and one that is eminently recognizable to us, is Black Lives Matter. This is a social movement, if ever there was one. It is a good example of a social movement because it is sort of decentralized and sort of dispersed, and it's a kind of pattern of movements or activities. It's not an organization per se, but it is a set of collective activities or demonstrations built around some collective goal or some purpose, right? The idea of a social movement we would associate with Black Lives Matter. We would think of Black Lives Matter as a social movement. And it really is a social movement for all intents and purposes. We would think about Black Lives Matter as exemplifying non-electoral political behavior because they're not going to the ballot box, they're not attending meetings or writing letters or calling senators. They may be as well, but what they're primarily doing is engaging in demonstrations, engaging in peaceful protests, assembling for the purpose of communicating some collective preference or some demand, imposing some demand or some claim on targeted authorities to varying degrees of precision depending upon the authorities or the particular location or the time or the place, so on and so forth. Black Lives Matter is a social movement. We would think of that as a social movement. Uh, Further back in time, you would maybe recognize Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street is really a precursor to Black Lives Matter. They have different objectives in the sense that Black Lives Matter is seeking to redress grievances and improve race relations and correct systematic injustices and imbalances in law, in society, in the distribution of power, in participation, etc. Occupy Wall Street it was focused on questions related to the distribution of wealth and income, and in some ways also political influence in how it connected to that economic inequality that was the fundamental source of grievance for Occupy Wall Street. Occupy Wall Street was also a social movement. Again, a characteristic is this kind of decentralized or kind of amorphous organization without any real leadership per se, but kind of this collection of actions and organized movement mobilizing protests and engaging in assembly, peaceful, making claims on authorities, protesting events or specific proceedings, and so on and so forth. This is the stuff of a social movement. And so we can define this concept and use a more precise notion before continuing and using it in analysis. And what we'll define it as is as collective challenges to elites, authorities, other groups, or cultural codes by people with common purposes and solidarity in sustained interactions with elites, opponents, and authorities. And so notice that it's not necessarily an organization. It doesn't have a legal personality or a leadership structure. It doesn't have a hierarchy. It doesn't have a kind of apparatus. It doesn't have a bureaucracy. It's not really recognizable in the ways that we would recognize a formal organization. Instead, it's sort of like an amorphous collection of challenges or contestations, con- challenges to elites, authorities, specific targeted groups, cultural codes or practices by people with common purposes or collective identity or solidarity, and in some sustained interaction with elites, opponents, or authorities. This is sort of a mouthful, but you get the picture. It's not an organization. Instead, it's kind of a pattern of challenges to authority or standard practice or elites by people in sustained solidarity and in sustained interactions with those elites, those authorities. And so this is a vehicle for ordinary people's participation in public politics. When I say ordinary, what I mean is, the people who don't have the advantage of deep pockets or moneyed interests behind them, the people who have no alternative but to form social movements with people of similar mind and similar position in society with whom they can work closely to advance some common goal. These are ordinary people. They are poor people. They are workers. They are peasants. They are uneducated people. They are educated people. They are students. They are people who don't enjoy privileges of formal organization or institutional representation. They are people who have to go it alone with others like them in some common solidaristic movement. And that's what a social movement is. And in this regard, social movements are different from parties because parties have legal personalities. They are formal organizations. They're different from coalitions because coalitions are combinations of parties. They're different from unions because unions are sanctioned and codified by the state. And they're different from advocacy groups because advocacy groups also have a particular designation that sets them apart and establishes a greater deal of formal organization. And so a social movement is something else. And a social movement is especially important to non-electoral participation because social movements are to non-electoral participation what political parties are to electoral participation, in the sense that whereas parties structure electoral politics, social movements structure public non-electoral politics. And in that regard, they enfranchise ordinary people, and they really do more than just enfranchise those people. In the best cases, in the most successful cases, they represent and promote and advance the interests of those people. And on that note, we're going to consider one of the most interesting examples of all, which is the example of Brazil's landless workers movement. And this is basically a movement of rural workers, a movement that totals about 1.5 million people, by the way, mostly peasants who by definition don't own land. Um, and they squat. They squat on unused land. And they do so in large numbers and for the purpose of appropriating that land and turning it to productive use. And the reason that they do this isn't just because they have a huge aggregate or mass of people who fall under this movement, but also because there's a constitutional basis in Brazil for squatting on unused land. Now, this doesn't mean that they do so uncontested. In fact, as I'll show you in a moment, they frequently provoke violent opposition and reprisal by landowners and by security and police and even the state. But the whole point is that they do this in collective solidarity and common purpose for the sake of squatting on, appropriating unused land, and then ultimately promoting agrarian reform. And what they want is they want a more equitable distribution of land in Brazil. Brazil has one of the most unequal distributions of land in the world, despite being one of the biggest countries in the world in terms of overall land. It's one of the most unequal in terms of the distribution of land, and a very tiny sliver of elites controls most of the land, and they do so in a way that shuts out the rest of society and prevents wider participation in the economy and in politics. In a lot of ways, this unequal distribution of land in Brazil is the product of a colonial era and the legacies of colonialism. But the landless workers movement has made it its objective to advance agrarian reform and bring about a more equitable distribution of of land. Now, let's watch a video that actually goes into quite a bit of detail discussing the movement, talks about its tactics, talks about some of the risks involved in engaging in this kind of challenge to landed elites. It talks about the various actors involved on each side, and it talks above all about what kind of non-electoral behavior these landless workers are engaged in.
It's one of the most exciting and organized social movements in Latin America today, but you probably haven't heard of it. Movimento Sem Terra, or MST, means Movement of the Landless. In their hundreds of thousands, Brazil's poorest people squat unused land right across the country. Every step is fraught with danger as they face the guns of powerful landowners. But what they're fighting for is vital. Brazil is huge. There is so much land. 500 years ago, the Portuguese invaders divided the country between themselves. Today, most of Brazil is still dominated by a very few wealthy landowners. Meanwhile, millions of people without land crowd into the cities. They come escaping rural poverty and dream of a better life in the big city. But when they arrive, the reality is often very different.
Quando aqui a pessoa chega logo, a pessoa sofre muito, né? Aqui não é que nem na terra da gente, né? A gente tem medo dele sair e não voltar mais, né? Que nem o medo da gente é esse, né?
Unequal land ownership creates misery in Brazil and forces people to take the law into their own hands, physically taking back the land.
Essa terra nós só vamos conquistar com a força de cada um. Certo. Nós estamos buscando aquela terra prometida. Estão animados ou não estão? Que beleza!
Land is a life and death struggle in Brazil, with many occupations ending in violent eviction.
A polícia mata o pessoal nosso, os fazendeiros matam o pessoal nosso. A gente entra na terra, a gente corta a cerca e põe a bandeira do MST lá.
Gilmar dos Santos Alves left his life on the streets of São Paulo to join the MST.
Esse aqui é minha esposa, né? Minha filha, né? Aqui são a roça, né? Eu vou criar minha filha dentro de São Paulo, que eu não acabei de falar para você.
minha filha aprendendo a cheirar cola, não tem como, aqui não tem isso. Às vezes à noite nós está dentro de casa, escuta a cachoeirinha que tem lá embaixo. Já, assim.
It's a hard-won paradise, but persistence and courage pays off when settlers win legal rights to the land they have occupied. Over 350,000 families now live in self-run settlements right across Brazil. Direct action has put the issue of land ownership center stage. The MST is offering a real alternative. The Brazilian government and media calls them terrorists, but with a network of schools, clinics, and sustainable farming, in fact, they are leading the way.
A gente vai com esperança, porque quando você está na cidade grande, você está sem esperança, sem emprego, e quando o MST chega assim e fala assim, olha, vocês são brasileiros, vocês têm direito à terra.
The MST are risking their lives to win back power and land for the poorest people of Brazil, taking people back into the countryside to rebuild their own communities.
I've always been very inspired by the landless workers movement. I gave a speech on the movement when I was in, I think, like, I don't know, middle school. But I was really interested and I was struck by how they used what was essentially a real legal mechanism to affect change and to kind of redistribute land within the system in a radical way. And this is constitutional political behavior. It's not illegal behavior, but it is risky behavior in the sense that the landowners will take matters into their own hands and kill them and do. And for all these reasons, it's incredibly interesting and very, very radical, and it's inspiring. It's one of the, if not the largest social movements in Latin America. And as the largest, it's a good example of the effectiveness of effective non-electoral political behavior. And one of the questions I want to ask you later, and that will set the stage for the rest of our discussion this week, is what can social movements accomplish that voters can't? You know, when you are willing to take these risks, what can you potentially do or accomplish or achieve that you can't achieve going to the ballot box? And what is the appropriate balance between risk and reward? And where do you draw the line? And I think that the landless workers movement has, you know, tried to figure that out and has figured that out pretty effectively. But this is an example that we can come back to as we discuss this. And there's some interesting commentary in the chat. Tessa says, would protest and other forms of grassroots organization also be considered non-programmatic? So, Tessa, and remember, all of us, that those programmatic labels really refer mainly to linkage strategies used by parties, political parties, and in their efforts to reach out to and connect with voters and to establish the support of voters. And so that may not apply here because we're talking about social movements, but protest and grassroots organization, if by non-programmatic you mean sort of non-electoral or non-traditional or kind of non-routine or non-electoral, yeah, protest, grassroots organization that involves challenging or confronting authorities or elites in some sustained way outside of constitutional or normal channels. Absolutely. And when I say outside of constitutional channels, I just mean that when you go to the voting booths on voting day, on election day, you vote and you participate. That's formal electoral participation. But if you protest and you go and you disrupt traffic, you're engaging in non-electoral participation and, you know, potentially, you know, breaking the law. But that's not the issue. The point is that that's not electoral behavior. That's non-electoral behavior. And please, whom among us hasn't disrupted traffic or participated in protests? I, at least, when I was in Chile, living there, doing field work and studying, I did participate in some protests, and yeah, it's just part of it's part of it's part of participating in public life, right? So we draw that distinction between non-electoral and electoral just so that we can understand that there is participation within the system, and then there's participation outside of the system. And voting is participating within the system, but protesting can potentially take place outside of the system, although protesting is a constitutionally protected right as well. So we should recognize that typically in a democracy, protest is a valid form of behavior, although it is a non-electoral form nevertheless. So what are some other examples of social movements? Can you think of any other examples as we develop this concept and think about this form of organization? So Brittany says the NAACP. I think that's an advocacy group. And an advocacy group has a slightly different sort of organization and structure than a social movement. But that's a good, a good sort of guess, right? Grace says women's rights. Yeah, the women's rights movement is totally a social movement. Doesn't have a formal organization or structure, but it does represent common or collective challenges to ingrained, practices, and really practices of misogyny and in male dominance. And so the women's rights movement is a social movement. Ishan says the Freedom March. Isn't the Freedom March an event, like a specific event? I don't know what the Freedom March is. If it's a specific event with like a date and a time, I don't know if it counts. But if it's a loose like aggregation of like challenges to some authority, it would count. I don't know what that is though. Arlene says people would protest against abortions. Pro-choice or pro-life movement. Yeah, totally. Those count. Those are examples. Hargan says the farmers' protest in India. Yeah, I think the farmers' movement, I think there is sort of an agricultural movement or kind of a farmers' movement in India. That is a good example, Hargan. Yeah, I think we would want to make sure that there sort of is like a sustained collective purpose in a sustained interaction with elites or the government, and that it's not just like a single protest. If it's a single or just a few protests, it might not quite constitute a movement. Typically, a movement spans many years or decades and becomes something kind of larger than any specific period of time. I don't know enough about the case of India though to say, but if it's what you say, it certainly does count. The women's suffrage movement, yeah, totally, absolutely, and that's a movement that we could say continues to this day in many places, like Saudi Arabia, where there's a continued effort to extend rights to women, and those include the right to vote. And of course, keep in mind that Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. It's a dictatorship, right? So who votes anyway? But the point is that women's rights and suffrage in particular are examples of movements. Oscar says environmental movements. Yeah, if you could be more specific, right? Like the environmental protection movement. Chandon adds again the farmers' protest. Zeri says the recent movement of Stop Asian Hate. Yeah, I think that is certainly collective action in displays. We'll see in a moment that that is one aspect of what becomes a social movement, but that typically a social movement is more inclined towards sort of demonstrations of collective action. So like large protests or assemblies, large coordinated efforts. And so yeah, I think that the Stop Asian Hate movement has the potential to become a social movement, but it would need to become something longer in time and exhibit more of like coordinated collective action through assemblies and protests and like large mobilizations. There's sort of a fine line between like public behaviors or like individual displays and then like collective social movement action, which is something that takes place on like a very large scale and usually involves planning and coordinating and like strategic decision making by small groups within a larger like unorganized movement. Animal rights activism, yeah, that does count. Environmental movement, yeah, the pipeline protest is one example. The Chicano student movement, that is an example. Americans with Disability Rights Movement, yeah, although I think Americans with Disability is a formal organization too, but certainly that would count. I just think it matters. See, as we can see in practice, it kind of becomes difficult sometimes to distinguish. March for Our Lives, Me Too movement, LGBTQ rights movement. Orlando says, could the Black Panthers be considered a movement? I think the Black Panthers had sort of a formal organizational structure, though, didn't they? There was sort of a kind of organizational apparatus, and a social movement is more kind of diffuse than that. I think the Me Too movement counts, sort of. Remember that social movements involve a lot of coordinated collective action. The Me Too movement, I think it has more elements of just kind of like changes in cultural awareness and um, changes in uh, cultural norms around um, issues of women's rights and women's freedom from unwanted uh, attention and harassment and assault. And I don't know if it counts as a social movement though, because social movements typically involve sustained and large scale confrontations with authorities or elites. I think that the Me Too movement did, of course, involve some marches, but I think that we would need to see a little bit more of like a kind of maybe more clarity regarding the goals of the movement. The civil rights movement certainly counts, though. I don't know what the Freedom Riders are. Does anyone want to share what that is? What are the Freedom Riders? So there are a lot of different examples of social movements. The Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, this is a group of mothers of the disappeared in Argentina during the military dictatorship. Every Sunday or Saturday, I think it's Saturday, beginning in like 1981 or 1979, and to this day, mothers of children disappeared by the military regime would meet in the Plaza de Mayo, which is the square in the federal district in Buenos Aires, and they would assemble and peacefully demonstrate and protest in requests to learn about the location of their disappeared children, and they became iconic as fighters for justice and for the protection and the enforcement of human rights, and for remembrance and memory in a place that to this day remains very traumatized because of the dictatorship. Very important social movement. They became incredibly important to transitional justice in Argentina and everywhere in the world. There is the example of the Tiananmen pro-democracy movement, the 1989 Tiananmen Square incident, infamous for the tank photograph, the man confronting the long line of tanks, the tanks representing the state and the repressive authoritarian regime, the tank man representing the social movement, the pro-democracy movement, confronting the authoritarian state, demanding liberalization and demanding freedom and demanding more channels for participation. Although he was one man, he was indicative of the pro-democracy movement and of their sustained confrontation with the state. And in fact, in the 1989 incident, the military massacred hundreds and hundreds, even thousands, it's reputed, of these members of the pro-democracy movement. And this became an example of the lengths to which dedicated social movements would go to promote their cause, even in the face of vicious, certain repression. And the Chinese government, the Communist Party, has done everything in its power to prevent any information about the incident from getting out. And to this day, they closely police information about this incident. And still, though, the key lesson is that it's an example, it's exemplary of social movements and the courage and the lengths to which that they will go to promote a common goal or objective. And I actually have a video here that I want to show you. I'm going to pause the recording because